Welcome everybody. We'll get going. A scattered crowd, but I don't know, which maybe come this way, but we'll leave it there. I'm Mark Rosenthal, medical oncologist at Peter Mac and Royal Melbourne and the Women's, and very pleased to introduce this Monday Lunch Live, which is about early career researchers and their troubles and problems and issues that they might or might not have had in learning how to become a principal investigator. And we've got two outstanding young speakers. Just before we start, as we always do, I'd like to acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri people, of the Kulin Nation, and pay our respect to their elders, families past, present, and emerging. You've got a list up there of the upcoming Monday Lunch Lives, and as usual, I don't know how to do that, but it's lots of interesting topics. So today, we're celebrating International Clinical Trials Day. On Friday, we had clinical research staff, 240 people in the room, a wonderful day. And today is to look at early career researchers. And the VCCC is really trying to play a pivotal role in developing our early career researchers so that they have the opportunity to learn and be mentored and educated in the conduct of clinical trials. Very, very important. So, you know, I'm at the end of my career, but I've learned over 30 odd years how to run a clinical trial, and it's always been the mentoring and the environment that's been created by more senior clinicians than me. And hopefully we're doing the same for the more junior clinicians coming through. Got two terrific young speakers, Alesha and Au-Yeung, who are going to talk to us about their principal investigator experiences. How have they come as early career researchers to become principal investigators? First up, that was clever of me, Alesha. So she's a medical oncologist at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre with an interest in lung cancer and head and neck cancer. And most of us who are a bit older are incredibly jealous of the fact that Alesha was pivotal in a New England Journal paper on squamous cell cancer of the skin, so a cancer of the skin and immunotherapy. Not many people at your age, Alesha, get to be a third author on a New England Journal paper. That's a pretty remarkable achievement. And she's doing a master's on the immunological basis for virally driven head and neck cancers. So delighted to have her come up and give us a talk.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at International Clinical Trials Day and my experience, I guess, as an early career researcher and the journey I took to get to this point. I wouldn't say, Mark, you're quite at the end of your journey yet. I imagine you'd have a bit more time. So I actually come from sunny Perth over in WA, and I made a decision about 8 to 10 years ago to move to Victoria and specifically Melbourne for the career opportunities that are afforded to me here. I tolerated the wind and the rain, but the cancer centres and the number of patients here really gave me many more opportunities than what would be available at Western Australia at that time. When I arrived, I did my general medical training and my medical oncology training at a variety of different tertiary and regional cancer centres and general hospitals. I've had the privilege to work at the Austin Health, Northern Health up in Epping, Horsham out west, that was an interesting time, Border Medical Oncology, which is based in Albury on the border of New South Wales and Victoria, and obviously Peter Mac Hospital. And I chose Peter Mac initially several years ago when I came here as a first-year medical oncology trainee, wide-eyed and quite excited because of the research that was going on here, not only clinically but also in the laboratory as well. This is just a snapshot of what the Parkville Precinct has been doing in clinical trials in the last 12 months. There's 159 trials that are open at the moment, and we've accrued 500 new patients to clinical trials in the last 12 months. And there's 60 or 70 new trials that have been submitted each year, and 40% of them are in early drug development, which I think is really exciting. In the trials unit alone, there are about 100 staff that are involved or employed, and that doesn't actually include the doctors and all the support and ancillary staff that, that work together to provide care for patients on clinical trials. What I found though was that the reality when I first arrived here was that managing patients in clinical trials, there is a reality to it, and it's a lot more complicated, and people put in a lot more hard work than what I anticipated. Typically, there would be a patient with a carer in an inpatient or an outpatient setting. I would be part of the medical team looking after the patient. But then we have all the other groups of people that would be responsible for the patient as well. The ward nurses who would look after the patient if they were admitted for any complications or observation. The radiology department, making sure that the scans happen on the right person at the right time on the right body part. The pharmacists who not only make up the drug, but also ensure that there aren't any interactions with medications that we might otherwise prescribe with the trial medication. The chemo day unit, who have to ensure that the drug is administered safely. And a lot of our patients as well don't come from the metropolitan area. They might live regionally or rurally. They might also not necessarily be in a financially stable situation. And so social workers are incredibly important to provide that sort of assistance to patients. And to provide this sort of cohesive care for patients on a clinical trial, it's really important to acknowledge the trial coordinators and the nurses, because really they're the ones that are liaising with all these groups, ensuring that the patient's journey through the clinical trial is as smooth as possible. The other reality of clinical trials that I came to very quickly realise is that there's an enormous amount of paperwork. And rightly so, because we need appropriate governance, but it is a lot of work and effort by everybody involved to ensure that everything gets done correctly. I think the other thing as well to recognise is that clinical trials or any research from the basic level in the laboratory all the way to phase 3 sort of clinical trials requires funding, and that can be from a variety of different sources, including pharmaceutical companies or collaborative groups. So I finished my time at Peter Mac as a oncology trainee, and then I went off and worked in other different cancer centres, and then I eventually came back as a clinical trials fellow, where I looked after patients with head and neck or lung cancer, and predominantly patients that were on clinical trials. And I came back for a few different reasons. My main reason is probably the patients. It's probably the most rewarding thing I find in working in clinical trials. You develop quite, I guess, therapeutic and long-lasting relationships with patients because you follow them on their journey quite intensively while they're on trials. I have mentors here, Ben Solomon and Danny Rishan, who have been great role models for me. And long term, I also recognised that I wanted to be involved in research in some sort of capacity in the long term. So while I was here as the clinical trials fellow for 2 years, I was lucky enough to be involved in the Regeneron trial, which Mark alluded to before. And that was for patients with a type of skin cancer called cutaneous squamous cell carcinoma. And it's the second most common cancer diagnosed in Australia. And that's really because of all the UV exposure we get. Now, the majority of patients who have this cancer are curable with surgery alone. But if you are unlucky enough to have disease that's unresectable or metastatic, there's actually no approved systemic therapies. Chemotherapy can provide some response, but it tends not to be durable. And so this clinical trial offered patients the opportunity to be able to receive a type of immunotherapy drug called cemiplimab. And we started seeing some pretty dramatic responses in our rooms. There is a clinical photo coming up, so if you are squeamish, do look away, although it's not terrible. So what we started seeing in the consult room were patients who've had very dramatic responses. And so in the top panel there, you can see a patient who has deposits of cancer on their chest wall, who 24 weeks later has essentially had a complete response. And then in the bottom panel, there's a different patient whose metastatic disease you can see light up with the black spots throughout the body. And again, about 20 weeks later, we can see on the follow-up scan that patient has had a very good, almost complete response. What was then published from this clinical trial that was running here at Peter Mac and worldwide, although we were the largest recruiter globally, is this journal that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, where Danny Rishan was, who's the head of medical oncology, was one of the co-lead authors. And this waterfall plot is pretty exciting and not something we often see in head and neck cancer, where each bar represents a patient and the y-axis represents the change in tumour burden. And so what we can see is that the majority of patients actually had a significant reduction in their tumour burden. This is what the public sees. So on the same day that the trial, that interim result of the trial was published in that article, and the results were also presented at a conference, this was the front page of the Herald Sun with the catchy title, "Wonder Drug Stuns Doctors by Whacking Skin Cancer." And that photo was a very unplanned, impromptu TV interview that I had to give that day, surrounded by 3 very tall, very blonde news interviewees, which was a terrifying experience. I hope not to repeat. But really, actually, you know, what I think it means is that for these 3 patients who were involved in the trial, amongst many others, is that they actually got the opportunity to have a lot more time with their family and friends where they might not have been able to. And I think that's really the focus of a lot of the work that we do here is to really sort of see stories like this. The other thing, I guess, that was really good with this trial that I got to experience firsthand is that I got to see how a result from a clinical trial could be translated into changing clinical practice quickly afterwards. And so a few months after the results of this trial came out, the FDA approved the treatment, this particular drug for the treatment of patients with this skin cancer. There are some challenges in clinical trials, and I just told a particularly good story. And I think often the hopes and expectations of not only patients, but of doctors and the medical staff as well, don't necessarily match up to the reality of clinical trials, in that only a small percentage of drugs that will be found to be effective enough to change clinical practice. One of the other issues is that there may be no appropriate trial. So you may have patients who would be fit enough and who would be excellent trial candidates, but there isn't anything in this hospital, in this precinct, in the nation for the patient. And the last reason I thought I'd mention is that not all patients are eligible, and that can be very frustrating. So patients may have the right type of cancer, but they may not have the right mutation, or they may have a comorbid condition, meaning that they're not eligible for that particular clinical trial. And that forms the rationale of why I then decided to focus on a particular area in my research as part of my higher degree. I talked before about how this drug cemiplimab was found to be effective in the clinical trial setting for patients with this particular type of skin cancer. That translated to changing clinical practice by the bedside. But actually, some of the things that I learned on the trial was that patients who were immunocompromised, who are at much higher risk of skin cancer than the normal population, were excluded from the trial because of that comorbid condition. And so I wanted, one of the aims of my project, of my research project, is to compare patients with this type of skin cancer who are immunocompromised versus those who have a competent immune system, and to see what the differences are. And so this is a completely unstaged photo taken early in the week with one of the senior research assistants, Richard Young, who's been quite pivotal in helping me adjust from the clinical life to the laboratory life. I think the journey that I've had and the positive experiences really have been guided by a lot of the people that I work with, particularly Ben and Danny, who've been my supervisors, as well as the clinical trials team, the clinical teams themselves, the patient navigators and the research team. And a lot of my research wouldn't be possible without the Peter Mac Foundation grant, as well as funding from the College of Physicians. Thank you.
So we'll have some questions after our next speaker. So Alesha will come back and we'll have her in the front seat. So next speaker, as an early career researcher, let's see if I can go down here, is George Au-Yeung, who's a medical oncologist now by training. He did a PhD in ovarian cancer with David Botel, really a first-class laboratory in this institute, and is now a medical oncologist in gynae oncology and also melanoma. And he's going to give his talk on his experience as an early career researcher.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone for attending. I guess in a similar way to Alesha, I just thought we'd sort of step through my own background and where I came to doing what I do today. And certainly as a early first and second year oncology trainee, I had some exposure to clinical trials, but hadn't really delved a lot into how to manage and recruit patients on trials. And part of the motivation to have that experience was to come here as a clinical research fellow. And in that year, I was able to actively participate as a sub-investigator and identify and consent patients to clinical trials and manage them on the trial. And Mark asked about sort of light bulb moments, and I recall one very clearly in my fellow year where I was able to consent the first patient in the world to a clinical trial called Outback, which was led by one of my supervisors at the time and someone who is still really important to me, Professor Linda Mileshkin, who was the global PI for that study. And I think something that was a huge achievement for Linda, and a credit to her that she's managed to run that trial. And I still remember the room and the patient and exactly where I consented to that first patient globally too. And amazingly, she got actually randomized to the intervention arm, which was a great achievement as well. And that really was a light bulb moment for me, because it meant that to me, actually, people from Australia could lead this work, and it didn't have to be that we were passengers. We could really help to drive clinical trials and drive clinical and translational research. And that sort of led me on to stay on here as a PhD student in David Botel's lab, as Mark mentioned. And really the main aim of that time in the lab was to really understand research and how to improve my own personal knowledge base, but specifically how to ask a research question. David talks very often about if you design the wrong experiment, you're going to get the wrong answer. And that holds true in a laboratory experiment, but it holds true in clinical trials too. And that's something that's really, I've found more in retrospect. At the time, it was more of a challenging thing. He'd make the experiment 10 times more complicated, but in actual fact, that was an important part of my actual personal learning. And so he's remained a really pivotal part of my ongoing research. And yeah, I don't think I'd be where I am today without those two people. So between sort of post-PhD, I sort of dabbled, I guess, in being a local site PI for some industry trials. And that in some ways was a nice transition for me to get an understanding of a few more of the higher level aspects that are involved in running clinical trials, and without the somewhat added pressure of being the, say, global PI or the coordinating principal investigator or a investigator-initiated trial, which I'll come to in a second. And also in that time, I went to a few workshops on one led by here, the VCCC, called How to Be a PI. And that was a really great experience to, again, hear from some experts in the field and understand the various different groups that go into running a clinical trials, from the study sponsors to the clinical research organizations and the regulatory bodies and the clinical trial units, and exactly what it all goes into making a clinical trial work. And following on from that, I had the great pleasure of being able to be the PI on 2 investigator-initiated trials, one of which is open, the other one which I think we may have just received approval for this morning, both of which came directly out of work from our laboratory and have been a rewarding yet challenging experience to be the principal investigator for. And, I think that having learned those steps along the way has really helped me be the PI on those studies. And I think that's a really nice learning curve that I've been able to go on, and I've been able to learn from each of those individual experiences, and hopefully the third trial that I run will be a little bit more smoother. Mark mentioned that I also do melanoma, and as part of being in the position that I am, I've been lucky to have the opportunity to be nominated as part of a member of the Global Steering Committee on a really exciting new trial for melanoma, which involves something called a personalized cancer vaccine. It's a really exciting platform for cancer treatment to combine with immunotherapy. And we were able to actually, again, put the first global patient on the trial. And And the company were fantastic in recognizing our success as being able to put the first patient on the trial globally. And this has made great access to clinical trials for our patients. And that by doing that and managing the trial relationship well, it does mean that in future that we hope to be able to continue to offer patients other new therapies as they become available. And again, these opportunities wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for really people like Danny Rushin and Grant MacArthur, who are senior mentors and people in our institution, that we have the access to. I've learned a lot from these two people as well, and for them to provide me with these opportunities has been really wonderful. I thought I'd just finish kind of summing up both Alesha and I's experience in some ways by having my personal kind of learnings and tips for success that I've sort of thought about. And this is actually something Mark taught me, and that's to know your role and play your role. And this is somewhat of a footy term, I guess, but in some ways it's true of life too. And he taught me that as a principal investigator, that the responsibility lies with you. And if you don't know how to do it, then you need to go find someone that knows how to do it and get their advice and seek their advice. And if they're not, if they don't know, then you need to find someone who does, and that responsibility lies with you. But that similarly, if you play your role well, that will mean that you build relationships well. And that relationships are really important, again, in life, in footy, in clinical trials. And those relationships mean that if you are successful, that success will breed success. And if you manage your relationships well, then they'll continue to come back to you. And those opportunities that I think that I've been able to obtain really are because I've been building good relationships and have good mentors. And then that involves not just me and these teams, but a whole bunch of people that are listed here, from vendors and clinical trial organizations such as BACT here in the building, a wonderful resource to tap into, including clinical trial managers and statisticians, Cancer Trials Australia, who handle a lot of our ethics submissions. Without their expertise, we couldn't have such quick turnaround times that, again, are recognized globally. The clinical trials unit, as Alesha has mentioned before, a wonderful team of study coordinators and research nurses who help look after our patients on clinical trials and manage all the running around in the background. And Nexomics, who are a division within our pathology department, who enable us to develop these great biomarker-driven trials to be able to do tests on our patients' samples, to be able to identify them for the appropriate clinical trial. And one of the things that I've learned along the way is that in the past, I used to think of industry as somewhat of a, I think enemy is a strong word, but in some ways an adversary. But in actual fact, they're a great collaborator, and they have great opportunities for collaborating for clinical trials, but also translational research. And that's a very big focus for industry, is to understand how their drugs work, who their drugs work best in, and how to get them to work in the right population of patients. A few other things: be creative, work hard. No success is without hard work. But at the same time, don't panic. And I think that people often feel like they're running in a race in their training to get to the end of the finish line, but there isn't a finish line. And people can panic that they're not going to get a job here or not going to get a job there, but actually, I don't know of any unemployed medical oncologists. Enjoy the wins. Again, this is something Mark taught me too, actually, that I think if you, for example, having that first patient globally recruited to the trial, you really have to share that win. That wasn't just on me. That was a contribution of a whole group of people, and you really need to be inclusive and, call out those people that that helped you along the way, and that really helps kind of maintain that really wonderful relationship you have with them. And the last thing is something I really struggle with, and any tips welcome, but balance is kind of important too. And I find that, I have 2 small children, and I don't spend enough time with them, but they do provide some balance to my life, and I really enjoy the time that I spend with them. That's it.
So we'll just have maybe 10 minutes of questions, and then, in fact, the second part of this will be Kate Cameron is going to tell us about the IIT program, the investigator initiated program from the VCCC. So my advice about balance, I think you already know, and Alesha might be relevant, is get rid of your teenage daughters if you can. It's probably the best bit of balance for me anyway. All right, so can I just start off? Maybe I'll start off. Got a few minutes. Happy to take any questions of any nature. What do you think the impediments were to your career? So you've talked about the positives. In fact, let me ask George, when you said you were nominated for an international group, you nominated yourself or someone from Russia nominated you? Who nominated you?
Brad did.
Okay.
In part, I think partly based on my kind of expertise and background, and that's again something that you develop, right? That's the things that you can control. And yeah, I think one of the other things that I like to say is control the controllables. And so all I can do is be as well trained as I can be, have those great relationships, and build the skill set. And then I was, I think, in the position to be offered that opportunity. And that's been a really great experience.
So the point I'm trying to make is we've seen a couple of examples where very senior medical oncologists have not taken something, they've given something, whether it's Linda or Danny or Ben Solomon or Grant, and that's the way it's got to be. These people are actually giving up quite a lot to give you the opportunity. So tell me, what are the impediments? What have you thought? Oh, that's a wall I have to climb over or run through.
Mine's probably more personal, but I think probably would affect a lot of people, which is overcoming your own self-doubt on whether you can do something or not, or whether you're qualified for the role that you've been nominated for, or when you receive praise about something that, like that, a particular win, that you might not feel that, it's not necessarily your work. And it's true in some part, because obviously you work as a much larger team, and on your own you get able to achieve the things that you do. But I think for me, definitely trying to overcome that self-doubt and push myself and put my hand up to try and do more than participate in it.
Yeah, mine's kind of simple as time. I think a lot of these things take time. Alesha alluded to the fact that there's lots of paperwork involved in running clinical trials, and each trial tends to have their own list of regulatory approvals that people need to go through, and each of those things needs eyes on it. And when it comes to IST, then the time and the work actually rests on you. And I've learned a lot from that in running my first IST over the last 12 months. Is that it really means that the responsibility falls on you to make calls about every query that comes in. And so having the time to dedicate to each of those important questions is really challenging, on top of all the other work that somebody has. So having enough time has been my biggest impediment.
Questions from the audience? Just wait for the microphone. So the question is, how do you work through the red tape?
Yeah, I think we're in a really fortunate building to be surrounded by people with expertise in each of those areas. And I certainly, as a PI, wouldn't be able to reel off all of the things that are involved in that. Kurt's here from Clinical Trials Australia, who have great expertise in a lot of those aspects to do with ethics approval, governance, budgeting, and they have a budget expert within them. And I've had a 15-minute meeting with them, and like a whole staff just in 15 minutes. And similarly, at the clinical trials team, they certainly have lots of experience with running clinical trials and developing protocols and governance, pharmacovigilance, statistical development, all of those aspects of the trial. And so it's also, I think, recognizing that it's part of a learning process, that you might not get 100% right that first time, and being able to recognize that sometimes you just need to learn from, if you make mistakes, just to make sure that you can learn from it. I certainly don't think that we did it perfectly, but being able to do it again the next time around makes it actually a lot smoother because you do understand, each of those things, because it does tend to be a little bit repetitive as you go on in each trial that you do. And so it's often the hardest the first time around, but as you learn from it, you make less mistakes, I find.
I don't have too much to add. I think just doing it, just getting the ethics approval is what you just got to do it, and you place it in paperwork to get that through, learning what all the acronyms mean and what each of those steps would mean for you. But look, I think in the actual approval and ethics application process, there is probably quite a bit of duplication that could be reduced to make it a bit more of a streamlined process, and I think that's true of any sort of centre anywhere. But yeah, I mean, otherwise the sort of go and do it.
Alesha, can you tell us maybe a time that things haven't gone so well? Are you old enough and experienced enough where you've just hit a brick wall and things haven't worked out?
All the time, every day. I think recently I had a young patient on a clinical trial, and they were very, very young, and I saw them, I guess, quite a lot over the duration they were on the clinical trial, and subsequently when their cancer progressed, they came off the clinical trial and looked after them for a period of time as well. And that was difficult because there was a lot of emotion and anger around the illness with the patient amongst the family, and also directed at the medical staff. And obviously that's not a personal attack, that's just a manifestation of grief. But I think that can be a massive challenge for the health providers, not only the medical staff, but the child nurses, child coordinators, all the other support staff, because you put in a lot of effort to help patients, and sometimes, despite everything that you do, things don't go well, and there can be a lot of anger on that.
George, have things gone swimmingly in your entire career, or have things fallen in a hole?
Yeah, I mean, this is a lesson actually new for me. Goes back to the vaccine study that I mentioned earlier. And, because it's a new type of treatment, there were quite a lot of questions about the regulatory approval process of that particular product. And I had made the assumption, and again, this is kind of comes back to mistakes being made when you assume things, that the process was being handled by a certain particular group. But that was holding up the approval process through ethics, and I had assumed that it was being taken care of. And then you said to me, this is your role, this is your responsibility. You need to go and sort this out, as PI. And so, I arranged to have a meeting with people.
Did I say it nicely, or I doubt it.
No, I think that the message was really resounding, right? I think that's the important part. So I went arranged a meeting and called in the right people, and bang, done. And I think that's helped actually with the future vaccine studies, because then this is not the last time these types of studies are going to happen, so that we as an institution have our eyes on it a bit better. And so I think that's helped me learn that lesson, both to not make the wrong assumptions, and to make sure that you know what your role is. And so that's really really great lessons to learn from that lesson.
Comments or questions? Anne, front. Hold on, wait for the phone.
So you mentioned that you had two great mentors who were a clinical trial fellow. I'm just keen to know, what are the key elements that made them great mentors? What were the activities?
No, that's a good question, because I think you have good mentors, you have lots of good mentors, the ones that are too busy to be available for you to chat to. I think my two mentors, they were generally always available for me to go to. Because their offices were physically quite close to mine, so I couldn't really escape. But I felt comfortable enough in our relationship that I could knock on their door and say, can you please help me with this? What should I be doing? What are your thoughts? and they were always very open and receptive to that, which I think makes a huge difference. I also think they, like Mark alluded to before, gave me opportunities. That they had interest in helping push my career forward as well.
I just follow up on that and say that the mentor-mentee relationship is a two-way street. But I think you need to be a good mentee, and I think that means that if you sort of deliver on things, you be productive, and you kind of if you want that relationship to be productive, you can't just be continuing to take money. And I think that that's a huge part of having that good relationship between mentor and mentee. There's a really nice young piece about that last year, and we talked about all these different styles of mentors and mentees, and I think that it's important for early career people to understand if they want to have a good relationship with their mentor, that they need to be productive and deliver on their end as well.
Quick question, one more.
Thank you for sharing your experiences. I suppose I want to pick up on a challenge you mentioned, Alesha, about the trials aren't for everyone. And, it's managing that expectation, and maybe as a young researcher, dealing with that emotion. But then on the other side, you have to be part of more clinical trials. I'm just wondering how you're balancing that at a very young career age, and also what advice you can give on that.
Yeah, it's really conflicting because you absolutely want to raise awareness in clinical trials, and we have functions like this, and we publicise clinical trials, we're trying to increase patient awareness, clinician awareness, and referrals to get patients on trial. And then it's hard to then balance that with the hope when patients come in that they want to get a clinical trial and you may not have anything available. And I think I don't have an easy answer on how I manage that. I think it's just being very clear and honest with the patient on the reasons why there may or may not be an appropriate clinical trial, and also, I guess, not taking away that hope and acknowledging that trials do come up quite frequently in the future, and there may be one at some point in the coming months that may be appropriate. Yeah, it's a tricky one.
I mean, from my perspective, having had two trials that I've written inclusion and exclusion criteria for, that's something I think long and hard about, to try to make it as inclusive as possible where possible. Because I think part of clinical trials is to make them as accessible to patients as you can be. And some of that's within your control, and as I mentioned before, you kind of just have to control what you can and what you can't. And that some trials will be very specific in terms of what they can allow, and other trials not. And some of it's in the way you explain that to patients, so that their expectations aren't, crushed, or that you manage those expectations appropriately. And a lot of the trials nowadays have this, pre-screening for the appropriate biomarker. And I think one thing we probably underestimate or it's one part of ongoing studies research is to evaluate how much that pre-screening component actually affects patients and their families. I think they come with the hope and expectation of being on the trial, and that in reality, maybe only 20% of the patient population is going to be eligible because you're trying to select for a relatively uncommon biomarker. And we don't quite know how much that affects people.
So before we move on to the second part of the talk, which is going to be about the IRT program, and Kate's going to tell us about that, I would say thank you so much for wonderful presentations and interesting discussion. I would say the thing about being a mentor, and we've seen a couple of great examples, is you've got to be prepared to give something up, which those mentors have done. You have to be prepared to work really hard behind the scenes, running off your shoulders. And most important, I think every mentor tries to identify who the young guns are. So, we have a lot of people come through here with registrars and fellows, etc. Not everyone is sitting here. And I think it's a measure of Alesha and George that they've sort of been selected by the mentors as saying These are potential stars. We have great respect for them. We've identified them and we're giving them the opportunity. So I'd like you to thank George and Alesha. As usual, the VCCC goes to no expense. Okay, now it's my pleasure to welcome Kate Camley up. So Kate has had a long career in clinical research and clinical trials, working both at the Peter MacCallum when it was in East Melbourne and then the PCCTU. And now she's the program manager for the IIT program for the VCCC.
Thank you, Mark. So just a brief chat today to give you an update on where we're up to with the investigator-initiated trials program. So it's a program that, through a lot of discussion in the early days of the VCCC, was identified as being an area of unmet needs. Investigators need more support to do clinical trials, and how do we provide some of that support? And so that's what the program has been about. And we've got some runs on the board now. So it's just to give you an update on where we're up to with that and then where the next step is. Obviously, a lot of focus today has been on mentoring, and it's an enormously important part of the journey for early career researchers. But I think one of the things we haven't really touched on yet is what else can we provide around coaching. So mentoring is a long-term relationship. It's usually across a sort of career path, whereas we can also offer some coaching support, and that's one of the areas we'd like to see utilised a bit more within the VCCC is around, you've got a specific problem, it might be with your ethics submission, it might be with a particular part of your clinical trial, and how can we link you with appropriate people to get some of those resources to help you solve some of the problems. One of the other areas for the IIT program is the trial assistance scheme, and this is where we have the ability to support new early career researchers doing their own clinical trials. So the trial assistance scheme provides some biostatistics support, some trial management support, so anything from writing your protocol, getting a master PICF patient information consent form written, along with all the other management plans that you actually need nowadays to get through the ethics and governance process to actually get your trial supported. As both our early career researchers have alluded to, it takes an enormous amount of time and commitment to run your own investigator-initiated trial, and part of this program is to try to provide as much support as we possibly can in some of those areas. The other area that we do is around site management, and Kurt's here today and he provides us an enormous amount of support, again, to those that are successful in the trial assistance program to actually look at the ethics submission process, the amendments process, financial management, guidance on budgets and all of those sorts of things. So the trial assistance scheme is really vital, especially for the early career researchers, to try and give you some support and some guidance around getting your trials up and running. So to date, we've had 3 rounds. This is just to give you a bit of an overview. Please don't look at it too closely, but it's really just saying we've had 3 rounds. Each round we've been quite pleased. As you'll see, one of the things we're very proud of is the fact that our quality of our submissions is improving. So we had quite a few in the early days that were just not eligible for the scheme. They didn't meet some of the criteria, and obviously our message is getting a little bit better around the types of information that you need to provide in your submissions. I think the other thing that is really good to look at is that we're getting a lot of hits on the boards with early career researchers being supported to put in their investigator-initiated program trials. Obviously, there's a large team behind them, but those that are leading it, we're helping to sort of educate in developing up the processes required to do trials. You'll see from this slide, it's not just the medical oncology or the haematology trials that we're supporting. There's a lot of submissions coming in across the board to get the support. So if you're in a smaller group or a less experienced group to do clinical trials, please don't let that put you off if you'd like to put in a submission for an IIT EOI. And just to show you that all alliance partners are engaged, obviously with varying sizes. They have different ability to actually put submissions in, but at least everybody is engaged across the process. which is good to see. So of great excitement today is that we announced 2B, so it's an interesting numbering system, but this is our third round of expressions of interest that we've had for the IIT program, and we support through 2B 3 studies. One is a great project with allied health and nursing support, looking at taste changes with chemotherapy and palliative care with insomnia. And I think those 2 studies in particular really show that we're not only trying to change the outcomes for patients in terms of how their diseases respond, but also in symptom management for patients, because often that is what our patients really struggle with day to day. The third project is also an exciting project to support, because New Approaches is another VCCC initiative, and it's really great to see some crossing over of support that's happening with our programs. So those in total now mean that we've supported 8 projects to date. We still have a bit of money to spend, so I really encourage those who've got any sort of ideas to speak to your research and education leads within the VCCC, your mentors and your colleagues around, to develop up a concept that you can then submit to the EOI process to get further support. We hope to have our next round, which will be 2C, which will be our 4th one, to open in June at some stage. Obviously, keep an eye out with updates that come through from the VCCC on when that will be. But just to reinforce, it's around trial management, site management and biostatistics support, and it's a really great way for early career researchers who don't have the funds to be able to pay for these services themselves to get supported to do that through this program. Have you saw?
I don't think we need any questions. That was some information, and I'll just put that back up. These are the upcoming sessions. So to the audience, thank you very much to our 3 speakers, particularly our first 2 early career researchers. I really enjoyed the presentations. They were a little different and interesting. They look good. Style over substance is very important. And then to Kate, thank you very much. You know, the VCCC continues to do really good work. I'm actually chairman of that steering committee, so we are doing very good work. At least someone laughed. But you know, delighted that we've spent so much money on investigator-initiated trials. The early career researcher just marries beautifully with that. So thanks to our 3 speakers.